This content presents World War II historical events for educational purposes only, based on documented records to honor those who served and provide historical insight. This does not glorify violence, promote hatred, or spread misinformation. Viewer discretion advised.
The sirens wailed through the streets of London like 1,000 ghosts crying out for mercy, and I remember thinking that this was the moment everything would change. I stood on the rooftop of the barracks, my uniform still fresh, my hands trembling not from fear but from the overwhelming realization that I was about to witness something no man should ever have to see. The sky above was a canvas of death, painted with the contrails of German bombers and the desperate smoke trails of our Spitfires climbing higher and higher into the dawn. My rifle felt impossibly heavy in my hands, as if it weighed all the responsibility of an empire crumbling at its edges. Around me, other soldiers gathered, their faces etched with a grim determination that masked the terror we all felt in our chests. The air smelled of cordite, burning rubber, and something else, something metallic and acrid that I would later understand was the smell of human desperation. I had enlisted barely 6 months earlier, full of youthful patriotism and naive bravery, believing that my sacrifice would mean something grand and glorious. Nothing could have prepared me for the visceral reality of watching the sky itself become a battlefield. The anti-aircraft guns around the city began their thunderous song, shells erupting into the morning like angry fireworks, each explosion a prayer to a God who seemed very far away. I watched a German Heinkel come diving down through a wall of flak, its fuselage glinting silver in the weak British sunlight, and I could almost see the face of the pilot, a man not so different from myself, equally young, equally frightened, equally convinced of his own right. The distance between us felt infinite. Yet paradoxically, we were connected by this terrible dance of death that neither of us had truly chosen. The first Spitfire went down about 2 kilometers from where I stood, trailing smoke like a comet falling to earth. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I watched it descend, knowing that somewhere inside that tiny metal coffin was a man with a mother, perhaps a sweetheart waiting for letters that would never arrive. The anti-aircraft fire continued without mercy, turning the sky into a hellscape of explosions and smoke. I gripped my rifle tighter, feeling utterly powerless, as if my small weapon could do anything against the massive machines carving death through the heavens above my city. The other soldiers around me were silent, united not by words, but by the shared weight of witnessing something that would forever scar our souls. The battle lasted only minutes, though it felt like hours' time, becoming meaningless in the face of such apocalyptic violence. When the last bomber turned away and the engines faded into the distance, leaving only the crackling of fires and the wail of emergency vehicles below, I realized I had been holding my breath the entire time. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my rifle, and tears streamed down my face without my permission or my understanding. I looked at the faces of my comrades and saw my own shock reflected back at me. We had glimpsed something we could never unsee, experienced something that would forever divide our lives into before and after. The city below was burning, and all I could think was that this was only the beginning. I descended the stairs with leaden feet, each step a journey through a world that suddenly felt alien and hostile. The officers were barking orders, but their words seemed to come from very far away, passing through water to reach my ears. I realized in that moment that I was no longer the boy who had enlisted 6 months ago. Something had broken inside me, or perhaps had awakened. War had no longer been an abstract concept or a noble cause. It had become personal, immediate, and absolutely terrifying. As I took my position for the next watch, staring up at the sky where danger could come at any moment, I understood that innocence was truly dead and what remained was only the grim determination to survive. Night fell with a suffocating darkness that seemed to press down on the city like a physical weight, and I stood watching my post, every nerve strung taut with anticipation. The German bombers were coming again. We had received reports that the Luftwaffe was preparing for a sustained assault on London, and the command had warned us that tonight would be different from the morning engagement. My stomach churned with a nauseating mixture of fear and resignation. I had seen what these machines could do, had witnessed the casual destruction they wrought upon our city, and now I was expected to stand here and wait for them to return like a man calmly awaiting his own execution. The other soldiers moved about with mechanical efficiency, checking ammunition, testing communications equipment, going through the motions of preparation, while our minds were somewhere else, entirely trapped in the terrible expectation of what was to come. The reconnaissance pilots had reported that German bombers were massing on the French coast. Hundreds of aircraft preparing to make the crossing of the Channel. I tried not to imagine what that must look like. The sky darkened by the sheer volume of enemy aircraft. The coordination required to send so many machines of death across the water. Around 11 o'clock, the first alarms began to sound, and I felt my heart rate spike to a dangerous level. This time, the bombers were coming in even greater numbers. I could see them first as distant shapes against the moonlit sky, tiny dots that grew steadily larger and more menacing. The anti-aircraft guns began their furious barking, and the searchlights swept across the heavens like pale fingers desperately seeking something to grasp and destroy. I watched a bomber caught in the intersection of 3 searchlight beams, pinned against the night sky like an insect on a collector's board, and then our guns found it with devastating accuracy. The aircraft seemed to hesitate for just a moment, as if shocked by its own vulnerability, before erupting into flames. I found myself holding my breath, unable to look away from this spectacle of destruction. The bomber descended slowly at first, then with increasing speed, its trajectory becoming a river of fire across the dark canvas of the night. I could almost imagine the screams of the men inside, though the distance would make such sounds impossible to hear. Another bomber followed it down, then another, and I realized that we were actually winning this terrible exchange, that our fighters and our guns were holding the line against the invading force. Yet for every bomber we brought down, dozens more pressed onward, their bomb doors opening to release their terrible cargo upon the city below. I heard the whistling sound of falling bombs, a noise that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life, followed by the apocalyptic thunder of explosions. The entire city seemed to shake, as if the earth itself was convulsing in agony. Buildings that I had passed every day of my life were suddenly transformed into pillars of flame. The sky lit up with an orange glow that turned night into a grotesque mockery of day, and I could see the faces of my comrades clearly, faces etched with horror and despair. The British people had endured many hardships, had faced many threats, but nothing in our national experience had prepared us for this systematic, mechanized destruction raining down from the sky. I remained at my post through the endless night, my eyes never leaving the sky, my hands never straying far from my rifle despite the absolute knowledge that my weapon would be useless against these machines. I watched as the Luftwaffe attempted to systematically destroy everything we held dear, and I felt something inside me harden, crystallize into a resolve that transcended fear. My city was burning, my people were dying, and while I could not stop it, I could bear witness. I could stand here, fully aware of my powerlessness, and still choose to remain. That choice, small though it was, became my rebellion against the darkness. As the night wore on and the bombs continued to fall, I realized that this was what war truly was, not glory or honor, but endless endurance in the face of overwhelming force. This was the reality that no propaganda film or patriotic speech could ever adequately convey. The bombing raids continued for weeks. Each night, a fresh hell. Each day, a grim assessment of what had been lost. I found myself existing in a strange state of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor properly dead, just existing in the margins between one explosion and the next. The human body adapts to almost anything. I learned even to living in constant fear. My hands no longer shook uncontrollably. My heart no longer raced quite so dangerously at the sound of the sirens. This adaptation felt like betrayal, as if, by becoming accustomed to horror, I was somehow endorsing it, accepting it as a normal part of existence. I thought about the men who were suffering this same experience across the channel and realized with a kind of sick clarity that somewhere in France, German soldiers were likely having identical thoughts, waiting with identical dread for the night to bring its familiar chaos. During the daylight hours, when we were supposedly off duty, sleep became impossible. I would lie in my bunk and listen to the sounds of the city recovering from the previous night's assault, clang of rescue equipment, the calls of air raid wardens, the sounds of parents trying to comfort children who had witnessed things no child should ever witness. I began to understand that trauma was not a singular event, but an accumulation, a gradual erosion of the soul that occurred through constant exposure to humanity's capacity for destruction. My mind invented strange coping mechanisms. I would recall memories from before the war with almost religious devotion, the taste of my mother's apple pie, the feeling of summer rain on my face, the sound of laughter at a pub on a Friday night. These memories became precious beyond measure, fragments of a world that seemed impossibly distant now. One afternoon, I encountered a young boy no more than 8 or 9 years old, standing amid the rubble of what had been his home. He was holding a teddy bear that was singed and torn, but still recognizable as a plaything that had once brought joy. I approached him slowly, carefully, as one might approach a wounded animal. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much, that carried a weight no child should ever carry, and asked me if the Germans would come back tonight. I knelt down to his level and found that I could not lie to him. Yes, I told him, the Germans would probably come back. They would keep coming until they destroyed everything, or we found a way to stop them. The boy nodded gravely, as if this confirmation was somehow less terrible than uncertainty, and then he simply walked away, clutching his bear like a lifeline. That encounter struck something profound within me. I realized that I was not truly fighting for king and country anymore. I was fighting for that boy's future, for the possibility that he might someday know a world without fear, without the constant threat of annihilation from above. This thought sustained me through the long nights more than any official propaganda ever could. The motivation became personal in a way that transcended nationalism or ideology. I was fighting so that children would not have to live their entire childhoods in bomb shelters and air raid sirens, would not develop the terrible adaptation that I had developed, would not have their innocence stolen by the casual violence of mechanized warfare. I began to observe my fellow soldiers differently after that encounter, seeing in each man the personal stakes of our survival. We were not abstract concepts or interchangeable military units. We were sons and brothers, and someday perhaps fathers, all of us, locked together in this terrible crucible of war. The camaraderie that developed between us was forged in shared suffering and shared purpose. We would joke grimly about the bombers, make black humor out of horrors that would have been unthinkable in peace. This humor was not cruelty. It was survival, a way of maintaining our sanity in an insane world. At night, before the sirens came, We would sit together and discuss futures that we could not be certain we would see. These conversations mattered more than any official communication or command. They mattered because they asserted the reality of tomorrow, even when tomorrow seemed impossibly distant. The weeks turned into months, and still the bombers came. I lost count of the raids, lost track of how many nights I had spent staring into a sky lit up with destruction. The initial shock had faded, replaced by something worse, a kind of numb acceptance that this was simply how things were now, and perhaps how they would always be. I heard rumors that Churchill had visited the bombed areas, that he had stood in the rubble and declared that we would never surrender. These declarations felt distant and hollow to me. Surrender was not a choice for those of us on the ground. We had no choice but to endure because the alternative was unthinkable. I began to wonder if the men in command, the politicians and generals making grand strategic decisions, truly understood what it meant to live night after night with a certain knowledge that death could come at any moment, from any direction, against which no defense was truly possible. I witnessed things that I could never adequately describe to anyone who had not been there. I saw buildings reduced to rubble in seconds, saw the rescue workers pulling bodies from the debris with increasingly grim efficiency. I saw a woman emerge from a destroyed home holding a loaf of bread, seemingly unconcerned about the devastation around her. I saw children playing in bomb craters as if these massive holes in the earth were playgrounds rather than monuments to violence. The human spirit's capacity for adaptation became both inspiring and terrifying. We could endure almost anything, it seemed, which meant there would be no breaking point, no moment where even the German High Command would be forced to recognize the futility of their assault. We would simply keep enduring, day after day, night after night, until either they ran out of bombers or we ran out of people to bomb. I made friends with the other soldiers around me, formed bonds that I knew would likely not survive the war either, because one of us would not make it through, or because afterward we would return to our separate lives, and these friendships would become just memories of a time that felt increasingly unreal. One of these friends was a man named Thomas, who had been a school teacher before the war. He had a philosophical bent that sometimes annoyed the more pragmatically minded soldiers, but I found his observations oddly comforting. He said to me one night, as we sat watching the distant glow of fires across the city, that perhaps the real victory would not be military at all, but rather spiritual, that if we could endure this, if we could remain human and decent in the face of such inhumanity, then victory would have already been won regardless of how the war ultimately ended. I did not entirely believe him, but I clung to his words like a drowning man clutching driftwood. One evening, just before the sirens sounded for yet another night of bombing, I received a letter from my mother. It had taken weeks to reach me, delayed by the chaos of wartime postal systems. She wrote to me about the garden she was tending, about how my younger sister had joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, about the small inconveniences of rationing. Her words seemed to come from another world entirely, a world of peace and normalcy that I could barely remember. She wrote that she was proud of me, that she prayed for my safety every night, that she looked forward to the day when I could come home and we could sit together and watch the sunset without fear. I read her letter 3 times that night, each reading bringing tears to my eyes. The contrast between the world she was describing and the world I was living in became almost unbearable. I realized that I had become a different person than I was before the war, and I was terrified that I would never be able to transition back to whoever I had been. The boy who had enlisted, full of youthful enthusiasm and patriotic fervor, was dead perhaps only symbolically, but the death felt real nonetheless. What had replaced him was a man who had stared into the abyss of human destruction and found himself staring back. I could no longer watch a sunset without thinking about how it would light up the bombers for their final approach. I could no longer hear thunder without instinctively reaching for shelter. I could no longer feel true joy, only the temporary absence of despair. This realization struck me with a force that was almost physical. I had survived the war so far, had come through the chaos and destruction with my body relatively intact, but the real damage was happening inside, in places that no doctor could reach or repair. Spring of 1941 arrived with a sense that something fundamental was shifting. Though we could not yet articulate what that something was, the bombing raids, which it seemed like they would continue eternally, began to decrease in frequency and intensity. Our pilots reported different patterns of German aircraft, different formations, different targets. It took weeks for us to fully understand what was happening. Their resources turning their attention eastward toward the Soviet Union. The invasion of Britain that we had so long feared, that had seemed inevitable, was not going to happen. We had endured, and in enduring, we had somehow prevailed. The realization should have filled me with joy, with relief, with vindication of everything we had suffered through. Instead, I felt a complicated mixture of emotions that I did not yet have the language to express. I found myself almost missing the nightly raids, which I immediately recognized as a deeply disturbing sign of how thoroughly my psyche had been altered by months of constant exposure to threat. At least during the raids, there was a clear structure, a clear purpose. Now, there was only the vast emptiness of survival without immediate purpose. The soldiers around me seemed similarly disoriented. We had been so thoroughly focused on surviving the next night that most of us had not thought seriously about what came after survival. Some of the men began to relax, began to laugh more easily, began to plan for futures that suddenly seemed possible again. Others, like myself, found that we could not socially shift our psychological gears. My nervous system had been calibrated for emergency for so long that the absence of emergency felt like a kind of trap, as if the danger had not disappeared, but only hidden itself more cleverly. I stood watch on the rooftop of the barracks one clear night in April, looking up at a sky that was peaceful for perhaps the first time since I had arrived at this post. The stars were visible, which had become a rarity. The constant bombardment had filled the air with so much smoke and dust that the night sky had been obscured for months. Now, those stars stretched overhead in infinite abundance, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to our wars and our fears. I thought about the German pilots I had seen shot down, about the men inside those machines, about whether they had mothers who were also praying for them. I thought about the war spreading eastward, about other cities that would now experience what London had experienced, about other soldiers who would soon be standing where I stood, learning the lessons that I had learned. The London that emerged from the bombing was a city transformed. The physical damage was obvious: entire blocks reduced to rubble, famous landmarks damaged or destroyed, the familiar geography of streets and buildings forever altered. But more profound than the physical damage was the psychological transformation that had occurred. The people of London had been tested in the most extreme way imaginable, and we had not broken. We had endured, and in enduring, we had discovered something about ourselves, about human resilience and courage that transcended any military victory. I had entered this war as a boy seeking glory, seeking meaning. What I had discovered was something far more fundamental: the simple, terrible truth that we were all capable of enduring far more than we ever thought possible. As the realization settled over me that the immediate crisis was past, I found myself facing a new kind of challenge. The terror that had kept me focused and purposeful had diminished, and in its absence, I had to confront all the things I had pushed aside, all the feelings I had suppressed in order to function. That young boy I had encountered in the Ruble occasionally appeared in my thoughts, and I wondered what had become of him, whether his mother had survived, whether he would grow up in a world at peace, or whether more horrors awaited him. The weight of knowing what I had witnessed, what I had seen mankind capable of, began to bear down on me in new ways. I had survived the Battle of Britain, but I was no longer certain that survival was the same as victory. The realization came to me slowly and then all at once that I would never fully recover from what I had experienced. Even as the bombing raids diminished and London began its slow process of rebuilding, I understood that the true battlefield now existed within my own mind. The external threat had largely passed, but the internal battlefield was only beginning. I would wake at night in cold sweats, my heart racing, convinced that the sirens were sounding again, only to discover that the sound was coming from somewhere inside my own nervous system. My comrades were experiencing similar struggles. Some of them began to drink heavily, seeking refuge in alcohol from the thoughts that plagued them during daylight hours. Others became obsessively focused on their duties, as if by maintaining perfect discipline and order, they could somehow regain control over a world that had demonstrated its absolute chaos and unpredictability. I found myself developing an almost superstitious relationship with routine. I would walk the same routes through the city each day, as if by maintaining consistency, I could somehow prevent further catastrophe. I noticed that I was always scanning the sky, even now, my eyes habitually tracking aircraft that posed no threat. When I heard aircraft engines, even the friendly sound of our own bombers returning from raids over Germany, my body would tense involuntarily. My breathing would become shallow. My hands would find themselves searching for weapons that I could not use against the sky. This was not cowardice. I understood logically that the threat had diminished, but rather the language that trauma had taught my body, a language that my conscious mind could not override through pure will. One of my closest friends in the regiment, a man named Davies, who had been with me through the worst of the bombing, suffered what the officers awkwardly referred to as a nervous breakdown. He simply stopped functioning one day, could not get out of his bunk, could not speak to anyone. The medical personnel shipped him off to a hospital, and I never saw him again. I heard rumors later that he had eventually recovered, had returned to civilian life, but that he was a changed man, quieter, somehow diminished by what his own mind had put him through. Seeing what happened to Davies terrified me, made me determined to hold myself together through sheer force of will. I would not allow myself to break. I would not allow this war to claim my sanity as well as my innocence. This determination was perhaps my greatest mistake, a decision to wall off the trauma rather than process it, to deny my own suffering in the name of maintaining functional fitness. I began to experience something that I can only describe as a kind of philosophical despair. I had seen the worst that mankind could do to itself, had witnessed the casual destruction of everything that made life worth living. How could I return to a normal life after this? How could I pretend that my previous concerns about girlfriends and career prospects and what I wanted to do with my life still mattered? These seemed impossibly trivial in the face of the larger patterns of destruction that I had witnessed. The ideology of the enemy had been thoroughly repugnant, but our own side had not emerged from this conflict with clean hands either. We had participated in bombing raids on German cities, had seen photographs of the destruction we had wrought. If their bombing of us was terrorism, was our bombing of them something different? These questions tortured me in a way that the actual bombing had not. Thomas, the former schoolteacher, seemed to understand what I was experiencing. He found me one evening, sitting alone on the roof, staring out at the city, and sat down beside me without saying anything at first. After a long silence, He said that perhaps the point was not to answer these impossible questions, but simply to carry them, to refuse to let them drive you to either nihilism or false certainty. He said that the war had proven that easy answers were dangerous, that any ideology that claimed to have all the answers had already lost something essential of its humanity. We sat together as the light faded, not talking much, just being present with each other and with our shared understanding of everything we had witnessed. In that quiet companionship, I found something approaching peace, though I knew it would be temporary, that these questions would continue to haunt me for years to come. The war continued, but London itself seemed to turn the page, or at least attempted to. The air raids did not entirely cease. Germany launched its Viva-Pon campaigns, laid terrifying unmanned weapons that killed indiscriminately, but the intensity and frequency had diminished to a level that felt almost normal in comparison to what we had endured. I found myself settling into a kind of shell-shocked rootability, performing my duties adequately but without genuine engagement. The war that had seemed so all-consuming in 1940 and 1941 now existed alongside other duties and other thoughts. We received news of the wider worth of North African campaigns, the eventual invasion of Europe, but these seemed somehow distant and abstract compared to the visceral reality of defending our own skies. As 1944 approached and we began to understand that the end of the war might actually be in sight, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Victory, which had once seemed impossible, now appeared probable. Germany was being squeezed from both east and west, its resources depleted, its people suffering from bombing campaigns that were far more devastating than anything we had endured. I should have felt vindication, should have felt the satisfaction of knowing that our sacrifice had mattered, that we had helped prevent a terrible dark age from settling over Europe. Instead, I felt only a kind of exhausted emptiness. The cost of victory had been so terrible, and the world that would emerge from this war would be forever changed, forever diminished by what we had all endured and perpetrated in the name of survival. I discovered during this period that I could no longer connect with civilians the way I once had. When people would thank me for my service or refer to us as heroes, something inside me would resist violently. We were not heroes, we were survivors, and there was a difference. Heroes were the stuff of patriotic mythology, simplified versions of reality that bore no resemblance to the actual experience of war. I had survived by being relatively lucky, by being in positions where the random chance of shellfire and bomb blasts had not found me. Others had died despite being braver or more skilled or more deserving of life. The randomness of it haunted me more than any specific traumatic event. If luck had kept me alive, then I could make no claims about my own character or worth. The end of the war arrived with surprisingly little fanfare for those of us who had been through it. V-Day celebrations erupted in the streets, and there was genuine joy, genuine relief that the fighting in Europe was finally over. One participated in some of the celebrations, but I felt like a ghost moving through a world that was celebrating something I could not quite believe in. The injuries of war were not merely the physical wounds that the medical corps could treat. The real injuries were to the soul, to one's fundamental belief in the nature of the world and humanity's place in it. These injuries would not heal quickly, if they would heal at all. I had seen too much, knew too much about what human beings were capable of doing to each other when stripped of civilizing constraints. In the months after the war's end, I was gradually processed out of the service. The army, having no further use for soldiers, returned us to civilian life with minimal support and minimal acknowledgement of what the transition might entail. I returned to my home to find that the physical city of London had begun to rebuild, that life was moving forward with almost deterministic inevitability. My mother greeted me with tears of relief and joy, and I embraced her and felt absolutely nothing. She asked me about my experiences, and I found that I could not articulate them in any way that made sense. How could I explain to someone who had not been there what it meant to live with the constant knowledge that death was falling from the sky? How could I convey the feeling of watching people you knew, people you had trained with, suddenly cease to exist? The inadequacy of language became painfully apparent. I wandered through London in those early post-war months, seeing a city that was my home but that now felt unfamiliar. I passed through areas where I had stood watch during the bombing, where I had witnessed terrible destruction. Some of these areas had been rebuilt. Others still bore the scars of war. Empty lots where buildings had stood for centuries, before being reduced to rubble in a single night. I realized that I was looking for evidence that what I had experienced had mattered, that the sacrifice had resulted in something meaningful. The truth was more complicated than such simple narratives allowed. We had survived. The nation had survived, but the cost had been almost incalculable. As I stood in the ruins and looked up at a sky that no longer harbored immediate death, I understood that I would spend the rest of my life processing what had happened here, what I had witnessed, what I had become in the furnace of the Battle of Britain. Years have passed since those terrible nights when the sky erupted with fire and death, and I have come to understand that the war never truly ends for those who have lived through it. The physical scars have long since healed, but the internal wounds remain, sometimes dormant, sometimes suddenly active, with a vividness that erases the passage of years. I will occasionally encounter other veterans, and there is a strange recognition that passes between us and understanding that we share something that cannot be explained to those who were not there, something that binds us together across the years despite the different paths our lives have taken. We do not necessarily speak about our experiences. Sometimes a simple nod is sufficient to acknowledge our shared membership in a terrible club that nobody wanted to join. The years of reconstruction that followed the war became their own kind of warfare. The battle against trauma and psychological damage that official institutions have only recently begun to acknowledge and address. I have struggled with sleeplessness that no amount of medication could entirely cure, with sudden, overwhelming anxiety that would assault me without warning, with a sense of disconnection from normal life that made it difficult to maintain relationships or pursue a normal career. Some days were better than others. Some days, the weight of memory was light enough to bear. Other days, the memories would crash over me with overwhelming force, and I would be back in 1940, staring up at the sky, waiting for the bombers to come. I married, eventually, had children, attempted to build a kind of life that I had imagined before the war. My wife understood that part of me had been left behind in that terrible conflict, that she had married not just me, but also the ghost of who I might have been if the war had not happened. My children grew up with a father who sometimes could not be entirely present, who would occasionally disappear into some internal place that they could not follow. I tried my best to shield them from the worst of my trauma, tried to protect them from the knowledge of what their father had witnessed. I was partially successful in this, though I suspect they always sensed that something was different about me, that I carried burdens they could not fully comprehend. The question that has haunted me most throughout the years is whether the suffering was ultimately worth it, whether the outcome justified the cost. We prevented an invasion of Britain, preserved our nation and way of life. In that narrow sense, we won. But at what cost? How many people died so that I could be standing here today? How much potential was destroyed in those terrible years? How many children grew up without parents? How many women lost husbands? How many dreams died in the sky over London? These questions do not have satisfying answers. History moves forward, regardless of whether we can justify its terrible logic. regardless of whether we can find meaning in its random violence. I have returned many times to London over the years, to the rooftop where I stood watch, to the streets I patrolled, to the rubble that has now been replaced by new construction. The city has rebuilt itself, has transformed into something new, while maintaining connections to its past. I have watched as those who've lived through the war have gradually aged and passed away, taking their memories with them. I have become the last of my unit, the last among my group of friends and comrades who survived to tell the tale. This position fills me with a kind of solemn responsibility to bear witness, to remember those who did not come home, to ensure that their sacrifice is not forgotten in the endless march of history. On quiet evenings, I sometimes stand and look up at the London sky, clear now of any thread, peaceful in a way that would have seemed impossible to the young soldier I was in 1940. The sirens are long silent. The bombers have rusted away in museums and salvage yards. The terror has faded into history, yet the memory remains, as fresh and vivid as if it were yesterday. I have made peace with this legacy, understanding that the scars are permanent, that healing is not the same as forgetting. I carry the memory of those days forward as a kind of sacred obligation, a witness to what human beings are capable of enduring, to the terrible cost of conflict, and to the stubborn resilience that allows us to survive even when survival seems impossible. The Battle of Britain may be concluded, but its echoes continued to reverberate through my consciousness, through the consciousness of all who lived through it, reminding us of what was lost, and of what we fought to preserve. This testimony stands as an eternal record of one soldier's journey through the Battle of Britain, a reminder that behind every historical event are human beings with thoughts, fears, dreams, and profound vulnerability. If this story has moved you, if it has illuminated something about the human cost of war, I urge you to seek out other voices from this period. Read the memoirs, listen to the recorded testimonies, honor the memory of those who did not come home. Share this story with others, especially with younger generations, who must understand that the peace we enjoy today was purchased with terrible sacrifice. The Battle of Britain was not won by propaganda or strategic brilliance alone. It was won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, by soldiers and civilians who endured the unendurable and refused to break. Let this testimony serve as your call to remember, to honor, and to ensure that such terrible conflicts might one day be relegated entirely to history, that no future generation will have to know the terror of bombing raids and the paralysis of waiting for death to fall from the sky.